What is going on, guys? Vertivoden here, and today I'm going to do something I haven't done in a while. I kind of did this about a week and a half ago with a popular uh, presentation by some Harvard and Princeton graduates that talked about, supposedly how we can fix the current dilemma of the two-party system in America. And they basically just came up with the answers that everyone else already kind of knew was there, but there's no real path to implementing that anywhere in the near future. We even saw with this last election how it was shot down over, like, let's say, like 90% of the states that it was presented to. And so, I, like many people, believed in the idea of the melting pot that is America, and that idea of anyone can come here and become an American. But unfortunately, the fucking stupid uncle that we have, who wears a MAGA hat and doesn't know two shits about anything outside of his own little world and his underpaying job, um, they won, right? I'm gonna say, like, the South rose again, right? Like, we're leaning hard into racist uh, authoritarianism, and I get the feeling that so many people who want to, kind of kumbaya on the left and rally up the troops for, oh, we'll get them the next election. I'm like, motherfuckers, I don't think there is going to be another election. I mean, Trump and his advocates have said that. Literally, Steve Bannon today, I think I even posted it today, literally said he wants to see Trump, you know, have a third term, even though the 22nd Amendment says otherwise. But who fucking cares? Because the Supreme Court basically also said that women don't have bodily autonomy, right? So, like, Trump has been, like, absolutely clear that this administration is about deportation, tariffs, and political retribution. Um, the people he is already tapping into to head the FBI or the Department of Education or the CDC are there with the sole purpose of destroying it. And this is not hyperbole. This is all laid out in black and white in Project 2025's manifesto, 920 pages, which I think I've read about close to 500. So if you need to this, you know what? I'm not going to say that. I'll just post it again. And it clearly lays out how the religious right are looking to create a theocratic authoritarian government system by not only destroying the leadership in all those departments that the government basically heads, but turning them as a tool to either, I mean, all of it's to propagate more propaganda, but it's either a tool to disseminate it to the masses or monitor how the masses are reacting to it. And then obviously using the military as a tool to suppress any sort of, like, revolt or anything else. And I mean, the amount of faith that I'm seeing people have in the guardrails that are pretty much non existent right now, especially with how the Senate works, there's nothing stopping this next administration from turning our partial uh, oligarchy system into a full blown oligarchy. But here's the thing: all of these, like, billionaires that are just throwing millions at Trump right now for his inauguration, right? He's not even fucking president yet. And they're already throwing tens of millions of dollars at him to basically allow them to peel back any sort of government regulation that affects their part of the free market, right? To basically allow them to monopolize. But I think it goes further than that, that them throwing the millions, they see how, like, mass deportations or tariffs are going to hurt the economy. not only in the long term, but in the very, very close short term. And here's the rub: Trump isn't like he hasn't changed his messaging on that at all. He is still planning on going through with mass deportations and mass tariffs. And I think this is where the billionaires on the right are making a mistake, that they think their money is going to change his mind. This guy literally got the Supreme Court to let him off the hook, to basically carve out an exception that isn't even in the fucking Constitution for being basically allowed to do anything as long as it's under the guise of an official act of the presidency. And then, the American people doubled down and voted for him again, basically relinquishing any sort of convention against him. Now, it's not that he isn't expunged from any of this. The cases against him are dismissed, but they're not dismissed without prejudice, which means that, let's say Trump is a quote unquote good boy and he gives up the presidency after his next 4-year term is up, right? And that means those government entities can pick up the case and follow along with the prosecution. What is the like, it's just so minuscule to me that that is even going to happen, right? Like, who in their right mind, especially Chump's mind, fucking Adderall laden, dementia, whatever that mush is still floating around inside of his head and leaking out his ass into his diapers. Sorry, I need a shot in between this. Uh, there is no way that I would say even a rational person facing those circumstances would ever let that happen, right? So, like, I really do believe that people are not fully comprehending how fucking bad the next 4 to however many years is going to be. So, on that note, though, sorry, it's kind of a pre-rant. Um, Still one of my favorite podcasts, even though I think he is deluding himself because of how little this affects him or will affect him. But the Chris Hayes podcast, Why Is This Happening? He has a guest on, and the title is How Democratic Backsliding Happens with Steve Levitsky. Now, I mean, this is pretty apparent. And he's not talking about the Democratic Party. He's talking about democratic processes. Well, I think he is anyway. And we're about to find out, but I'm like, we're watching this happen in real time. Like, that's the thing, is like, I get this feeling that people don't understand that we are going the way of, like, Hugo Chavez or Orban in Hungary, right? We are just, I don't know. I just think that's it for any sort of democratic process for America going forward. So let's find out. Well, let's see what they say about it. We're going to find out whether we like it or not.
Burgers you get today.
Fucking commercials. I'll try to get by this.
A lot about yourself. Insanely hot LDL. Delta Airlines rely. This is elevated.
I think there will be an election in 2028. I'm not as pessimistic as some. I don't think.
Right off the bat, I thought there's going to be an election. Yeah, there might be an election in 2028. Who the fuck cares? Especially if they're not even going to, like, come on. Trump, up until the day that people realized, up until the hour that people realized he won, he was, in all the swing states, he was talking about how there's this massive fraud. Oh, I won. Oh, no more fraud. Poof, the magic dragon lives by the sea, right?
We're sliding into fascism. I think there's a very good chance that the Democratic Party wins the 2028 election.
And there is the delusion that I am talking about. Fuck. Oh, this is going to be good.
It's not clear how we rebuild a consensus in favor of basic small d democratic politics. So I think what would have to happen, and I don't want to wish this upon our society, And I'm not even sure it's possible at this point, having lived through COVID and seen Trump come within 40,000 votes of getting reelected. But Trump would have to be a major disaster so that we create a broader coalition of.
What the fuck are you talking about? Like, he was a major disaster in his first presidency. Fucking millions died because of his mismessaging and inability to govern during a pandemic. How do you fuck up worse than that?
65% of Americans ready to do something different. And that's possible, but we haven't seen much
No,
evidence
it's
for that in the
not.
last 8 years.
Oh, God.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. I'm speaking to you the day after a remarkable scene unfolded in South Korea. Basically, the sort of right-wing populist president of that country who had won a very narrow majority back in 2022, President Yoon, who had seen his sort of political fortunes decline over time. The opposition party had won big in the last elections, declared martial law. Came forward and said martial law. And the bullet points of martial law were basically the complete suspension of what we would call a free and open society. The media was going to be controlled by the state, that there would be no independent demonstrations, the right to protest, the right to peacefully assemble, free speech was curtailed, no strikes, all the sort of basic mechanisms of civil society were suspended. And what the Koreans did was they took to the streets immediately in the wee hours of the morning in their.
Spoiler alert, that is going to happen here. And I promise you, it will not look like South Koreans protest, right? There may be mass grassroots protests like we saw in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But come on, no. It's, it would look nothing like South Korea here in America. Nothing. Too many people would support it.
Parkas in the very cold Seoul winter and defied the orders. They rallied to the Parliament building, which had been blocked off by troops, and Parliament members climbed into the building against the sort of stated wishes and orders of the military, of the martial law, and cast unanimous vote to overturn martial law, 190-0, including members of President Yoon's own party. President Yoon then came out and was like, well, take it back, my bad. No martial law. As I speak to you now, there's a process of impeachment that's going forward. And this was a really amazing moment for a bunch of reasons. One is South Korea is a young and tender democracy in many ways. It's really only been sort of a durable democracy since basically 1987, 1988. It had a series of authoritarian rulers after the Korean War. There was a military coup in 1980 and a kind of coup regime that lasted from 80 to 87, which was brought down through mobilization and street protest. It's a place like Brazil, another country that toiled under a military junta as recently as the 1980s, that has a real memory of what it looks like when democracy goes away and how precious it is and how it has to be fought for.
And this is the part, I'm sorry to interject again, but this is the part that America does not have. Even in the wake of the Civil War, states in the South refuse to acknowledge not only a defeat spiritually, but educationally, right? Even today, in 2024, soon to be 2025, there are history books that write that the South did not lose the war. Right? That it was a peaceful resolution over a misunderstanding, and that slavery wasn't as bad as people thought it was. Neither was the war itself. We do not have anything comparable to that in any generation that is living right now in terms of memory. We have that on foreign soil, but not here at home. I mean, just look at how fucking people reacted to January 6th, specifically how they're supporting it. Like, this is not something that will happen here.
That's something that I think we don't quite have in the same way in the U.S. We're, by some measures, most measures, the longest existing democracy in the world, depending on how you want to define it. Depending on how you define it, you can make the argument we're the longest existing democracy in the world, but generally people don't have recent memory of, say, life under a military junta and what that would look like. And so now we find ourselves in this situation in which we are facing the possibility of genuine democratic retrenchment and some version of kind of presidential authoritarian dictatorship or something of that form, something that's different than the kind of liberal democracy we've become accustomed to. And I thought it would be great to talk to someone that just studies this, that studies basically the process by which a democracy might backslide into something that's less democratic or not democratic. Stephen Levitsky is a professor of government at Harvard. He serves as the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. He's a New York Times bestselling author of a number of books, including How Democracies Die and Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point, which he co-authored with Daniel Ziblatt. Professor, it's great to have you in the program.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So can we start first on how you got interested? This area of sort of democratic backsliding is now front of mind, not just in the U.S., but a lot of places. This is a sort of transnational trend. But it didn't feel to me like this is a particularly like hot area of study for a long time. And I'm curious how you found your way into thinking about this and studying this.
Well, I wrote a more academic book about 15 years ago about a regime type that we call competitive authoritarianism, which is
this is just a fun little fact. When someone says 15 years ago, I think 1985. That's how fucking old I am.
It was a time when democracy seemed to be spreading across the world, and it was kind of assumed that everybody was democratizing. But my co-author Luke and Wei and I observed that a lot of regimes would take the sort of constitutional form of democracy, hold regular elections, allow opposition, but tilt the playing field or allow the playing field to be tilted against the opposition. So many regimes in the world, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Africa, in the former Soviet Union, were hybrids in which there were elections, there was opposition, there was a constitution, but the playing field was tilted against the opposition. So I spent 10 years writing a book on this, and over the last decade or so, as it became clear that U.S. democracy was wobbling, began to think about how that could potentially happen in the United States, which frankly, 20 years ago when I was doing this original research, I couldn't have imagined. Maybe I should have.
Can you explain more what you mean by what's an example of a competitive authoritarian system and what are the features of that?
Well, today I think the best example in the world is Hungary, which is, Viktor Orban doesn't lock up any of his opponents, doesn't have any blood on his hands, has reformed the constitution, but maintains a constitutional system. At least thus far, elections have not been stolen. They've been technically clean, but the government has managed to use the state apparatus, use the apparatus of government to co-opt and to bully a lot of the private sector, the media, either onto the sidelines or into self-censorship, has been able to change some of the rules of the game, to pack the courts and the prosecutor's office, gerrymander electoral districts to give the incumbent party a significant leg up over the opposition. So there is an opposition, there are regular elections, but the competition is not fair. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez is another example. Contemporary Turkey is another example. There are dozens of such regimes across the world.
And one of the things, Turkey's a really interesting case because I remember being in Turkey relatively early in Erdogan's trajectory, where there was a much more open question about, he came in with the AKP and it was a big deal that this party, this formerly opposition party, had won. And there were talks, it wasn't clear if he was an aspiring authoritarian, if he was just a populist figure who was going to actually in some ways solidify Turkish democracy, which had been wobbly in its own way throughout the years. But one of the mechanisms I'm interested in here is how public opinion works, because the thing that I worry about most in the U.S. is I worry about public opinion being taken out of the picture or manipulated in such a way that you don't have genuine sort of competitive open debate, right? So that's what we've seen in these places where it's been effective in
Trump has already said that he's not going to allow the government to quote anything as misinformation. So again, not to preemptively Well, no, fuck it. I am gonna be. He's been telling us the entire fucking time that he's been running what his intentions are and what he wants to do. So yeah, just take it for what it is. He's already said that he's gonna do exactly that.
In Hungary, where you've got a ruling party that has 60% approval rating, right? Now, is that real in some sense or organic? Not really, because you can't detach it from the mechanisms by which civil society is manipulated. But it is the ruler is popular. Like if you call an election tomorrow, they're going to win, win in quotation marks. And I'm curious how you think about the role of public opinion in these kind of competitive authoritarian regimes.
Public opinion is crucial, and there's a wide range of variation. There are some cases, and the cases where autocrats do the most damage are where they're really popular, where they have 80% approval rating. Alberto Fujimori in Peru going back to the 1990s, Putin, Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Bukele today in El Salvador. But these guys, when they get 70 or 80% approval, they can do a tremendous amount of damage. By contrast, less popular autocrats, I would say Bolsonaro is one case, Trump's first presidency in another case. An extreme case is President Yoon in South Korea.
Yes.
He tried to pause. His approval rating was 19%.
Exactly.
Lesson for future autocrats. Don't try to declare martial law when you've got a 19% approval rating. You're likely to fail. And so the difference between an autocrat with 80% approval rating, even 60, versus an autocrat with 30, 40% support is huge. And one of the key things for the Trump administration going forward is, I mean, he won the popular vote for the first time ever in this election. I think people are kind of...
I need to fact check that because he won. I think what he means by popular vote is that in the percentage of people who actually voted, he won the popular vote. And I think it was by less than a percentage point, too. So, once again, way to go, America. You fucking artards.
Assuming he has potential for majority support.
Why are you talking while I'm doing this? What are you saying?
I'm fact checking you.
Oh, you're fact checking me. What do you... Go ahead, fact check me.
I think he may have lost the popular vote in the end.
Oh, did he? I mean, that's true. I thought he won it by, like, the thinnest margin in, like, American history. You probably are. I'm just saying that because I'm all worked up. You're probably right. Let's see what it says. Yes? No? Maybe so?
No,
No, what?
he won the popular vote.
He did. By what percentage, though?
1.7%.
Oh, 1.7. That's larger than I thought.
It's the smallest margin recorded since 2000.
Yeah. Well, 2000 was fucking robbed because of Brett Kavanaugh. That wasn't even...
Wait, 2000?
Yeah. Yeah, 2000. Bush v. Gore. Brett Kavanaugh was the judge, or no, was he a judge or was he... I think he was a judge on the panel that decided to stop the counting in Florida when Bush led.
Oh.
He was one of the people who helped stop the recount. I don't know if he was a lawyer or a judge at the time, but that's what solidified him in the Republican circle and the Federal Society to get him on the Supreme Court, was that. He helped give the presidency to Bush. Yeah. America, land of the free, my fucking asshole. Sorry, I'm all worked up.
I'm skeptical. I think he's going to be pretty unpopular pretty quickly, and that's going to present opportunities for the opposition.
I strongly disagree. He may become more unpopular because the dumb shit maggots who realize that, and even Trump said this like 2 days ago, that he doesn't think he'd be able to bring down the prices of goods and services because when it's up too high, there's not a whole lot you can do to bring it down. Ha ha! Fuck your feelings and fuck your wallets, you backwater hicks. Anyway, what was I talking about? Whether or not he does things that are popular or unpopular, I don't think is really going to matter, because Republicans who still hold the Senate and might hold the House, I'm not really sure on that. I mean, obviously we have the midterms, but fuck, see what happens there. I don't think that's going to dissuade those in his circle who he's put in charge of these administrations, and inevitably the fucking military, to curtail any of his actions.
I agree with that. Why? I know this is an impossible question. You can't answer some sort of like in some systemic comparativist way, but given the fact that you have worked across different systems, like the alchemy of public opinion, why is it like Bukele, in El Salvador, he's a sort of classic kind of populist demagogue, really interesting character in many different ways. But the big thing was, in one of the highest homicide rates in the world, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, a promise to, similar to Duterte in the Philippines, to sort of clean up the violence, and the application of severe government force towards the problem of crime, the problem of violent cartels, often with the suspension of human rights and sort of constitutional niceties, and that the crime rate has come down, and there's like a very clear sort of input-output legible story about his popularity there. But I wonder if there are broader lessons about like when it works, what makes someone popular versus not. What is the difference between a Bolsonaro and an Orban and an Erdogan, for instance?
Well,
I'm going to keep jumping in here. I'm too worked up to let this go without it. Tell the people all the lies they want to believe. That's what you do. That's how you become popular. And if you're Chump, you just tell as many lies as you can, so even the people who believe your lies can discount the lies that they don't like by virtue of keeping their own, basically. It's a crazy kind of cognitive dissonance.
The primary thing is whether there's a severe crisis and whether the government is able to overcome that crisis.
Interesting.
The real recipe for something for someone like Bukele is you inherit a terrible crisis, one that really badly discredits the political establishment, allows you to run against the entire elite and win, and then you resolve that crisis, or at least are perceived to resolve that crisis. And Bukele brought the homicide rate down literally from over 100 per 100,000, which is, I think, the highest in the world, to, I think, right now below the United States. I mean, El Salvador was unlivable, and it became livable again. And so he got the credit for that. And he will have 80%, 90% approval rating for at least a few years to come. Alberto Fujimori did the same thing in Peru. He came to power in a context of hyperinflation and a Maoist guerrilla movement closing in on Lima, and he managed to end hyperinflation and defeat the Shining Path guerrillas. That gave him massive support for, turns out to be about 6 years, 7 years. Doesn't last forever, but you can do a lot of damage with that support. In cases where there isn't a severe crisis, when you have just a really polarized society between two camps like Brazil or the United States, it's really hard to get, you've got a kind of a floor. It's really hard for Trump to fall below the high 30s.
Right.
But, 50-ish% of the population, maybe 55% of the U.S. population can't stand Trump no matter what.
Right.
Or let's say about 50% of the population. So
right.
that Trump is not going to be able to pierce that ceiling, or not without some kind of a exogenous shock that we're not foreseeing right now.
Yeah, and let's hope there is not one. Just knock on wood. The Fujimori is interesting. You're a Latin Americanist. I mean, that's where your area of expertise is. And one of the things I think that's interesting for this conversation is that, there's always this tendency in the U.S. where we think of our peer countries as Europe, right? Like the OECD countries in Europe. And so we look to Hungary as an example. But, America is very much a Western Hemisphere nation in many ways. And lots of people make the argument that it's illuminating to understand our particular institutional development through that lens. And I wonder if your background in history as a Latin Americanist, like how you think of that and the U.S. relationship to examples we've seen of the rise and fall of democratic regimes throughout the Western Hemisphere throughout the centuries.
Well, first of all, I'm a political scientist. We're not always so good with history, but I think your point that the United States actually shares a lot in common, in some ways more in common with Latin America over the last century than Europe, I think that's right. First of all, our institutions are much more similar to Latin America. Latin America is presidentialist as opposed to the kind of parliamentary systems that exist in Western Europe.
You know what? I was going to say something on Parliament and the differences between the two, but maybe he'll go into it, and maybe he'll probably do. If he does go into it, it'll be a better job than I can.
And I think that actually matters in terms of a populace being able to win and concentrate a lot of power. And secondly, the United States has Latin American levels of social and racial inequality, which is very, very different from Western Europe. And, you know, we often compare, as you said, we compare ourselves to Western Europe. And it is true that there is a kind of a liberal far right emerging, anti-immigrant nativist far right emerging across Europe, which is threatening to democracy. But that far right has not done anywhere near the level of damage to democracy in Europe, at least to date, as in the United States. The United States is the only established Western democracy where the far right has actually come to power alone, governed alone, and assaulted democratic institutions. That hasn't happened anywhere in Europe.
There's a very famous political science scholar named Juan Linz who wrote the very famous paper called The Perils of Presidentialism and wrote about presidentialism. And since you just mentioned it, it's probably worth talking about the structural aspects here. You know, the basic gloss on Linz, well, maybe I'll have you do it since you're the political scientist rather than me giving the gloss on Linz about, you know, what he sort of identified as the problem or the possible crisis that's born of what we call a presidential system.
Well, first of all, the executive branch becomes kind of a zero-sum game. When there's a presidency, it is often very powerful, or at least perceived to be very powerful, much more so than the legislature. A legislature is something, if all the power is in the parliament, that's something that can be divided up and shared, and you can govern through coalitions. Only one guy or one person, one party can capture the presidency. So you get kind of a zero-sum game, and those who win the presidency win it all, and those who lose are left out in the cold. And that Linz thought was destabilizing. He thought that divided government was destabilizing. That is not always proven to be the case, but in a parliamentary system, the prime minister has to have at least the tacit support of a majority in parliament. And if she loses it or he loses it, there's a vote of no confidence. You change the government peacefully, democratically, etc. A presidential system doesn't have that mechanism. A president can be very unpopular, can be in conflict with the Congress, and there's no simple or peaceful way to resolve that conflict. And you often get things like what just happened in South Korea, which is the president gets fed up with Congress and tries to circumvent the Constitution. That was another of Linz's concern. The third one is fixed terms. And in a parliamentary system, when a government loses support, it can be, again, removed and replaced by a new government very easily, very peacefully. In a presidential system, you have fixed terms. You got to wait to the end of the term, which, at least in Latin America, is often proven to be destabilizing. So that was Linz's concern. I think another institutional issue in the United States, which we don't always think about, is our first past the post electoral system, which makes it very likely we're going to end up with two big parties. And in parliamentary systems with a proportional representation election system, you're much more likely to have multiple parties that form coalition governments. And I think we are increasingly seeing that democratic systems are better able to absorb this sort of far right, illiberal third or 30% of the electorate in a parliamentary system than a presidential system. To oversimplify, the far right represents about 30% of electorates across Western democracies. A little more here, a little more there, roughly 30%.
Interesting.
That 30% has not done a lot of damage in Europe. It's either in the opposition, like in Germany, or it's a junior partner in some governments, like in Scandinavia, or it may even be a senior partner in government, like in Italy. But it shares power, and it has not yet, at least, assaulted democracy. The United States is the only country where that 30% was able to capture one of the two political parties and govern unilaterally. And I think that's a big reason why we've suffered so much more backsliding than Europe.
We'll be right back after we take this quick break.
This is a better conversation. Well, the conversation side that is better, I think, is with his host. Let's see if we can get past these commercials.
Drama that seems to follow
3 months for
lives, but with green light.
someone is the gift of
about 40 gigabytes on
I'm just a cable news host who watches.
Come on. There we go.
When you say we've suffered more backsliding than Europe, which I would agree with, but I'm not a scholar. I'm just a cable news host who watches this every day. I mean, how bad is it? How bad has it been in the U.S.? How would you characterize the degree of American democratic backsliding?
Well, let me start with just some seemingly arbitrary numbers, and then I'll get to
Yeah.
I'll try to color that in. Freedom House, there are several, every major index of democracy, every major organization that measures the level of democracy across countries has shown a marked decline for the United States over the last decade. I'm going to take one, a very mainstream organization, Freedom House. Freedom House has a global freedom index, scores every country every year from 0. I think North Korea might be a 0 to 100. I think Finland is 100. The United States used to be in the mid 90s, not quite Scandinavia, but 94, 95. A decade ago, we were, I think, at 94. Today, the United States has fallen to 83, which is still democracy, still above the bar for democracy, but it is below Argentina and tied with Romania and Panama. And that may seem shocking to many Americans, being below Argentina and tied with Panama. But we have had pretty systematic, pretty widespread efforts to restrict access to the ballot in many states in the United States over the last 15 years. We have had a dramatic rise in violent threats against election workers, election officials, elected officials, prosecutors, and judges. And we've had an incumbent president attempt to overturn the results of an election and violently block a peaceful transfer of power. And our institutions did not hold that president accountable.
Let's stop right there for a second and just revisit all of that truth he just said. Right? He wasn't held accountable. The boots on the ground, the state level prosecutions going against state level legislatures, lawyers, everybody around Trump at that time that was a part of the coup, they're all being held liable. Just because Trump won the presidency doesn't mean anyone else, even though, like, I think I read today, January 6th defendant basically in court was like, you know, basically threatening the judge not to charge him because Trump is back in the presidency. Like, the level of delusion with these fucking idiots is just unbelievable. And the fact that they're not going to be let off. I mean, there's possibility Trump may pardon them all, but that pardoning doesn't mean you aren't a criminal, right? That's not what a pardon is. A pardon is like basically relaying, saying, yeah, okay, you did this bad job, but we're going to have some, like, you know, what do you call it? Divine intervention, if you will, on the president's side, and you don't have to do your prison sentence. It's still on your fucking record, right? And anyone that is being charged with a federal crime, which are the only ones the president can pardon, that affects you your entire life when it comes to job opportunities, credit, buying a house, getting low, like, you're fucked. I mean, if you're rich enough where you don't have to do that shit, which a lot of the people are, you'll be fine. But I mean, the other one, there are still people like, I forgot her name. She was that, like, she was that raging cunt. She was, she literally threatened the judge, and, like, at her sentencing, she basically laughed at the judge. And she's now in federal prison, I think for like 5 years or some shit. But anyway, none of that goes away. And the fact that Trump, who is now president, is not being held accountable for any of his actions is only going to embolden him. And that's why I say again, like, when people talk about the 2028 election, number one, regardless, like, if there is even an election, I will be flabbergasted. And if the Democrats win, I don't know. That's just like, that's beyond, like, even my disbelief that we even had, you know, our first black president in my lifetime.
when those things happen, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because those things don't happen in Argentina. So that it's the rise in violence, it's the effort to restrict access to the ballot, and it's an effort without punishment by an incumbent president to overturn the results of an election that has led to the decline in the U.S. score.
So if we're diagnosing the source of this, there's a few things, right, that we've talked to. Like first, the sort of institutional design of the U.S., which gives it certain susceptibilities. One of those being presidential system where presidential power can amass. And we've seen a kind of concentration in the executive, over the years, particularly I think it's fair to say in the post-World War II era and the creation of the sort of defense apparatus that came with the Cold War. I think that was exacerbated by post 9/11, the war on terror, more and more concentration in the executive. Increasing polarization has led to dysfunction in Congress, which has meant that authorities have tended to sort of flow from the first branch to the second, from Congress to the executive. We also have a broader context of sort of populist right-wing backlash. And your point about the sort of first past the post two-party system means that through primaries, you could basically have this 30% capture one of the two major parties. And once it captures one of the two major parties in a kind of structurally polarized political system, it's got basically a coin flip chance in a given election. How sui generis do you think Trump is as a figure in all this? Like, I guess, how much does the person, this is a meta-historical question maybe, or a sort of theoretical question, but how much does the person matter, the person in the moment?
It matters. I mean, Trump clearly could appeal to some voters that I think no other contemporary right-wing politician has figured out to appeal to.
Yeah, I think that's an empirical fact. I think that's that's shown in the numbers.
And Trump, because of who Trump is, has been willing to cross some lines that I think even the Republican that you hate most would not cross. I'm not sure any other Republican would have just absolutely refused to accept defeat in the 2020 election. Trump goes to places that others would not go. The thing is, once he does it, and once we learn that you can get away with it, and you might even benefit politically from it, then you can't unlearn that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so taking Trump out of the picture doesn't make the effects of Trumpism go away.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say I don't think Trump is a completely sui generis figure. Just as there existed a liberal far right across Europe, that liberal far right was emerging obviously prior to Trump. You see very clear continuities with the Tea Party movement. And Trump was as much a product of this radicalization of the Republican Party as he was a cause of it. Trump won the primaries in 2026 because his ethno-nationalist, nativist, and in many ways authoritarian appealed to a lot of Republican rank and file. And so this isn't just Trump dropping in by accident. Trump was very much a product of the radicalization of the Republican Party.
And this is why I said in the beginning, which some of you may have been confused by, why I say that Trump is the rise, the South shall rise again, right? Yeah. Fucking Klan hoods are out of the closet and on everyone's head.
Getting back to your earlier question, Chris, I think, yes, our institutions made us vulnerable, but I think the real key variable here is the radicalization of the Republican Party, the transformation of what had been a pretty mainstream conservative party in the second half of the 20s.
Stop this. This is what I want people to stop doing. Stop fucking whitewashing the Christofascism of the Republican Party that has not only always been there, but I saw a resurgence with Reagan. Like in my lifetime, these sort of theocratic leaps and bounds that these, I don't know how to restate this, but Christofascist sort of ideology, it's not something that is like new in the last 50 years. And there's no such thing as like a mainstream Republican in the last 50 years, right? We had diversity within the Republican Party during like the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Yeah, I'd say most of the 70s. Well, I'd say some of the 70s. 75 is when it started to kind of like basically bind together. But Reagan was really the cementing of this new born-again ideology, that a resurgence that we are a Christian nation, and not only just a Christian nation, but a Christian white nation. in that white Christians, white male Christians, are the ones to make and implement the laws. And you see it already that this next congressional administration, it's all white males, right? We saw this like, oh, you know, female Republicans crying about how they're not leading any of the committees. It's like, boo fucking who? You knew who you were supporting. Go fuck yourself.
20th century into an increasingly undemocratic party, a party that was no longer committed to democratic rules of the game. And that's not just Trump.
How do you understand that happening? Why did it happen?
Well, there's a lot of debate about that. And Daniel and I have a position in this debate, which may or may not be right. But first of all, it's important to point out that it's really rare that this happens. It's really unusual. It's really rare in history or across the world to find a mainstream political party of the center left or center right that has been competing peacefully in elections for 150 years, is the case.
Shut the fuck up. Sorry, I just had to explain to my wife, and I this is not like a commonly known fact, but I'm like, again, the Bush v. Gore recount was stopped primarily by Kavanaugh, right? And I don't know, I couldn't tell you the other people that were in it, but like that action that decided the election in 2000, that cemented Kavanaugh's position on the future Supreme Court seat. This is not, I'm sorry, but this is not some back and forth like, oh, ha ha ha, you won, good luck, and we'll do what we can to fight you next. Like, no. Like, since Reagan cemented this idea in the Republican Party, and it was not that it was like uncemented before, but basically like mainstreamed it, that government is the problem, not the solution. And, you know, started defunding from the federal side universities, you know, and it blows my fucking mind. These fucking maggots are so goddamn fucking stupid. They're like, oh, the liberal universities and blah blah blah. Name me one fucking person that you had voted for that isn't a graduate of an Ivy League college. Just one. Ted Cruz, Harvard. Tom Cotton, Harvard or Yale or both. Like, just anyone, even fucking Trump, even though he paid his way, he went to Penn State. Ivy League, all of them. Like, oh my God, the amount of sheer fucking stupidity and self-delusion is just mind-numbing.
It's a Republican Party, for a party to go off the rails, to turn away from democracy. This is Daniel and I searched long and hard to find comparative examples, and really outside of the Democratic Party during Reconstruction, we couldn't find very many examples. The Thai Democrats in Thailand in the early 21st century is another case, but there are very few examples. This is an unusual event. It doesn't happen every day. Our explanation has to do with the United States' transition to multiracial democracy. That the United States over the last half century has been undergoing a massive transformation. And I think one in which, among other things, a long dominant ethnic majority is losing not only its majority status, but its dominant status in society. And that is a big deal. So we have, over the course of our lifetimes, really primarily in the 21st century, experienced a powerful challenge to long-established social hierarchies, racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, and other social hierarchies. And it's happened very quickly. It's happened relentlessly right before our eyes. And that has triggered a reaction. That has triggered a reaction among primarily white Christian men who feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them.
And ironically, they're the ones who wanted to sit there and say, fuck your feelings. These fucking virgin incels who are complaining they can't get a date or can't get a good job, who refuse to go to college or are too fucking lazy to do so. Like, the irony is just so thick.
And that generates a level of resentment and anger.
Fuck them.
that you don't see with for people who disagree with over healthcare policy or disagree over
Fuck 'em.
foreign policy. This is a level of anger and resentment that is much more intense. And I think all of us underestimated the ferocity of that resistance to the changes of the gradual changes of the last half century. And that's the
And this is why I believe that people are underestimating how fucking bad this administration is going to be. Like, I'm going to restate this. I am a gun owner. Never thought I would ever be a gun owner. I do not own a gun because I want to, right? And this is why I advocated for people right now, while you still can, you should purchase a firearm for protection, right? And I don't mean protection from someone trying to rob you or get your car. I'm talking what they call a military junta, right? Trump has stated clearly that he is going to be an authoritarian. Project 2025 is the party's blueprint on how to make that happen systemically. Like, people who are still in denial of this are like, I don't know there's anything anyone can say, because I understand how the human brain works, at least on a remedial level, that when, people are faced with information that they're just not comfortable with or they don't like, it's an automatic response for you to do not accept it as happening. And I understand that, but just because you don't expect it or don't believe it doesn't mean you can't prepare adequately for it. And I just don't think people understand really how bad this is going to be. And I don't know how it's going to play out, right? I have no idea, especially when it comes to like the military and let's say Trump did, incite martial law. Like, most of the bulk of the military force is very diverse. It's something like, I think it's something close to like 67, or maybe even as high as 70% minority based. And again, it's like, people are too fucking stupid in America to understand how that would affect a martial law authoritarian trying to take over power, right? It's like, yeah, you could have a lot of white generals giving orders, but if the masses are non-white and they see you're doing something that is clearly antithetical to the Constitution, which it's the Constitution that they made a pledge to, not to the president and not to a general, right? The likelihood of them following through is very low. People are too fucking stupid to understand that if you mass deport, right, everyone that is non-white, this country was literally built on, and to this day is only perpetuated in its wealth by the exploitation of minority workers, right? From day one to right now, that is how this country has built all of its wealth, is by exploiting labor of minorities. You get rid of that, what the fuck are you gonna do? You're gonna tell me that one of these angry, pissed off, white Republican MAGA hat wearing males is gonna go take $5 an hour and go pick strawberries in the field for 12 hours a day? Good luck.
base that Trump appealed to, that's what got him. That's the 30% that got him to power within the Republican Party.
And that same 30%, we've seen similar changes in different ways in, say, across Europe, right? Where countries have seen large influxes of immigrants, a sort of real change to even the sort of nature of what it is to be Italian, right? If you go and look at an Italian kindergarten class, right, it looks very different than the old men in the piazza, right? There's a significant and a very obvious demographic change happening across Europe. But in those countries, that is channeled into those parties of, in these kind of multi-party parliamentary coalitional situations, it's channeled into what we've seen, which is rising support for what are these basically far-right populist parties, but then they're embedded into the system in a very different way than what's happened here.
That's exactly right. I also think this is
still
a
bigotry.
little harder to quantify.
Like, I've heard him make this argument before that, like, these countries that are old, that have seen, these generational families basically see a changing in the demographic on the soil they toil on, it's so fucking what? It's still bigotry at the end of the day. Like, just call it what it is. Don't sit there and try and justify it.
But I think that the reaction to immigration is very, very similar. I completely agree. I think the issue of anti-Black racism and the legacies of slavery make it a particularly difficult problem in the United States. I think it adds to the ferocity of the reaction.
So what have you learned about, there are obviously places, I think we tend to think, we think in these kind of developmental terms. And I think we still have this framework, even as if you actually look in the long sweep of history, it's probably not smart because, there's been a lot, like one of the things I keep thinking to myself is, there's a reason we have a Greek word for demagogue. It's first invoked by Hobbes, which is that like charismatic leader who rallies the masses towards the project of undermining democracy itself is like one of the oldest problems of democracy, going back to, Athens. And so in some ways what we're dealing with is not new. And another way that I think is useful to think about is there's a teleological framework we have for the development of governance towards liberal democracy as the sort of endpoint. But as a historical matter, places have fluctuated and gone through different periods. And there was, it always blows my mind to like read about like Polish parliament, in the 19th century, because you think like, oh, right, yeah, they were running a democracy in Poland at some point, and then they weren't. Same thing in Latin America. There were countries that were democratic very early on, and then they weren't democratic. They became democratic again. If you think in these terms, right, not in this sort of arc, not in this line that ascends towards liberal democracy, are there lessons about what to do when a country that was democratic backslides, and then what the next step to get it, push it back towards democracy is?
If this is anything but prepared to actually fight in the streets, I'm really going to get pissed off, because history has proven one thing: you don't beat fascism at the fucking ballot box, right? We didn't beat Nazis at the ballot box. We shot them in the fucking face in broad daylight on their turf, on their soil, right? Like, this is where I tend to like break off. And I think that there is this way divide between irrational delusionism and like, just look at history. I'm not adding any sort of like emotion to this. Let's look at historical context. Like, I'm trying to think, when has there been a peaceful movement to overthrow? Gandhi may be the only one. And even that, and again, let's not kid ourselves, Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, were shot by religious bigots, right? So it's not like it works and then everyone's hunky-dory. You'll fucking die, right? So the leaders of a resistance against authoritarianism in a peaceful manner, I think Gandhi is the only example that I can think of historically where that worked, but he still got killed. And really, it only worked in getting the British relinquishing authority over the government, but the government itself then is turning him basically to a religious oligarchy, is where they're already at. And I think I'm not going to go too into that because I'm not really on the history of India. I've not really got on that, but I think that's the only way. Every other sort of conflict where authoritarianism has taken over a state, like even like Syria, right? Like, again, that's not people going to the ballot box, right? I don't know. It's just wild to me that people still think that is like a possibility when a fascist is in office.
I'm not sure that there's a simple recipe.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all,
yes,
I think all of it.
Yes, it is. When an authoritarian takes over, you fight back. Like, this is wild to me. These two speakers are roughly the same age as I am, right? We grew up during the Cold War, on the back of World War II. Like, every part of my education has been underpinned with the teachings and the lessons of World War II. And where we are now is 1937, 1938, right? The Nazis are in power. They're going to, and Nazis, I want to make this super fucking clear. I'm talking about Republicans, right? The Nazis are in power. They've told us, they have a blueprint that is out for everyone to read, how they will fundamentally fuck up the government and use it as a tool against the nation that it is meant to serve. Literally, it's out there. I will pin it. Their PDF, 920 pages, all for open for anyone to read. And so many people agree, maybe not with all of it, but enough of it to fucking support these Nazis, not only into the election, but after the election. And you're going to tell me that that is going to be beaten at the ballot box? Are you like, this is what I mean. This sort of delusion that this is, we're going to kumbaya together and everyone's going to vote. They're going to accept the vote and we'll just move on. Like, oh my God.
And I certainly include myself, have bought into this sort of developmentalist or teleological view of history that you just mentioned, especially strong since World War II in the United States.
Thank you.
And, you know, one thing that is new, especially since World War II, is the level of inclusion that we see in Western societies today.
What?
The level of racial and gender equality there's no precedent in Western history for the level of inclusion that we've seen in the last half century. And
So fucking what? Do you think that changes how authoritarians are beaten out of office? I gotta hear this.
I'm not sure what that means, but that has been a true that's
I'm
not cyclical.
Sure what that
Right,
That's
means.
a level of development that we haven't seen before. My experience with there aren't that many fully democratic regimes that have collapsed in the world. You can count them really on a couple of hands.
Right.
In almost every case, I mean, you can go back to the Netherlands in the 19-teens for a case of an elite sort of stopping short of the abyss. But in most cases, it's only after a society falls into the abyss that politicians sort of figure out, okay, we have to do this a different way. I think
Finally, I know he's being careful of his wording, but there you have it, right? Just looking at history, what happens right there? He just said it. That a society has to fall into the abyss before politicians finally go, oh, well, maybe we did something wrong. Yeah, no fucking shit. Like, this is why history repeats itself, because people are too fucking greedy to look at it and to understand how their actions are going to happen or how they're going to downstream to everybody else.
obviously Germany, Spain in the 1930s, Brazil in the 60s, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile in the 1970s. Polarization reached a point where democracy was lost entirely. People suffered often for a generation or more because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And only climbing out of it did politicians and activists sort of agree we have to do things differently. There are just not many cases of the regime beginning to slip or to slide and people kind of get it together and push back. I mean,
and again, this is not to say that the revolution by Gandhi was bloodless. Far, far from it, right? It's just that you cannot compare the ideology of Gandhi to any sort of ideology in America, the country where literally I think we have more guns than we have citizens. It's something like a 7-to-1 ratio right? Like, if there is ever a time when they're in, like, even during Trump's, up into Trump winning in 2016, there were social media sites all over and people, and I didn't understand this at the time, but there were a lot of like white angry veterans coming back from the Middle East talking about a Civil War II brewing. And again, this is back in 2016. This is almost 10 years ago. They were talking about this. And I thought that was just like some crazy, like, you know, because they thought Obama was going to have a third term. They thought about there's this Operation Jade Helm that was a huge conspiracy theory that people rallied behind, and that, you know, he was a Muslim and drank the blood of baby, all this kind of crazy shit. But that didn't stop when Trump won, right? It not only happened and continued during his presidency, but it culminated after he lost the election. And remember, January 6th didn't just happen. Like, you can go back and you can see his tweets on Twitter. Trump talked about January 6th less than a week after the election in November, and talked about how it was going to be this massive event. This was something that was planned pre the 2020 election. And a lot of people, I understand, don't know this. This is not some conspiracy theory. You can fact check me on this. Go to Trump's Twitter account and read his tweets, right? They still haven't been deleted because there was a federal indictment case. Again, he was federally indicted and the case is still against him. It's currently not pending because you cannot prosecute a sitting president of the United States, but they can't just delete it all of a sudden because it wasn't dismissed with prejudice. And since it didn't go to trial, double jeopardy doesn't apply. So again, I have to go. I don't know why. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm going through the logical thought process of someone who is going to be an authoritarian. Why the fuck would you give up power after 4 years knowing that that case that will put you in prison can be picked up by the government you just left? It doesn't make sense to a normal person, let alone someone who wants to be an authoritarian, right? It's just, I don't know, it's just wild.
We'll see what happens in South Korea. I mean, the South Koreans gave us an example, as you
Oh,
pointed out
shut
at
up.
the beginning
Sorry.
of this broadcast.
I have to do this. The cultural differences between South Korea and America are fucking huge. And as he said, they're a newer democratic society who, in their generational lifetimes, they have a lot of people who lived in the 1980s who saw this uprising, they know firsthand the dangers of authoritarianism. We do not have that. No one since the Civil War is alive any longer, right? We don't know the horrors that happened then. We're not in like recent living memory, right? That is gone. World War II is gone. Vietnam is gone. Most people don't even talk about the Middle East anymore and how so many people have just like suffered massively over that. I'm not even just talking about everyone in the fucking Middle East, right? I'm talking about the soldiers who come back who have this like, who've been, I don't want to say militarized, radicalized with this idea that, you know, they have to get back at the government that sent them over, right? Which again, like, I can empathize with that. I don't agree with it, but I understand that sort of like, you know, they entrusted a government with their lives. Granted, they did it when they're probably like 17 or 18 years old, and they're not smart enough to know the difference of why that's dangerous. But they did, and they sent him over to a war that was not only unjustified, but we couldn't win. And in the end, again, ironically, Chump gave back, right, Afghanistan to the Taliban. He freed 5,000 Taliban prisoners and gave authority over to the Taliban, I think a month before he handed off the presidency to Biden. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's Biden's fault. He had to, right? Trump made that international agreement with them. If the United States was known for breaking treaties or agreements from one presidency to the next, we would never be in any fucking treaty ever. No country would trust us. That's why presidents follow through with agreements that previous administrations have made for international and warlike agreements, for that very reason. And a lot of, again, I understand the mass of Americans are too fucking stupid to understand this. And all they want to do is just blame Biden for it. And again, don't take my word for it. Look it up. You can see Pompeo literally with the leader of the Taliban signing the order. I think Pompeo even, that fat fuck even like tweeted out about it with a picture of him. Again, don't take my word for it.
Of people quickly mobilizing in the middle of the night in the cold and defending their democracy.
That
I was
won't
very
happen
heartened
here.
to see that there were members of the president's party
Yes,
who stood up and opposed martial law. I mean, that's how you save a democracy. Right?
That's not going to happen here. We already know what happens to Republicans who stand up against Trump. Look at Cheney. Look at I'm not going to say his name right. Klinzinger. Any Republican who, whether on a federal or state side, backed or who backed the January 6th commission or who stood up to Trump, they're gone now. Right? They are just fucking gone. There is no Republican alternative to that. Everybody running has bent the knee and kissed the ring of Trump. And they did that because they know they can't win without it. Again, I'm sorry, this is not some like Republican Party of the 1950s where there was a lot of, there was a wide spectrum of opinion. This is Trump's party. And again, don't take my word for it. Look it up yourself. Look at all the people who ran in the last 4 years, specifically who are going to run in the midterms. All the Republicans will back Trump. I promise you, there will not be a single Republican running on any level, state or federal, that will not bend the knee to Trump in 2022. That is my one prediction I think will come true.
Two political parties that don't like each other, that compete against each other, that have been quarreling, join forces to defend democracy against an abuse like we saw a couple of days ago in South Korea. That's how you save it. That's what happened in Spain when there was.
I'm going to stop it here because I'm like, again, like they're using other examples that have either in their lifetime a generational of voters, people who have seen directly the effects of fascism, or who have a parliamentary system where having a multitude or have a no confidence vote to transition the government right then and there is possible. We don't have that, right? We have we have 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are from the Federalist Society, right? The quote unquote oh fuck, I'm so mad I can't even remember his fucking name. The guy who's supposedly in the middle who penned the whole like limited immunity 20-page bullshit story for Trump himself. This, it's just not going to happen. Again, these discussions do not further any sort of resolvement of how we're going to be able to do this, because the comparative analysis is against countries that either we don't have the historical context to compare, or we don't have the government system in place to be a one-on-one comparison. Like, if it, like, I'm not saying I don't hope it happens. I really do. We had the chance for it to happen, right? After January 6th, we had that chance. We had that chance in the subsequent 4 years, and nobody took it. And we had it again in this last election. And America as a whole decided to back the guy who fucking led an insurrection and who is a convicted felon, right? I have absolutely no faith that any of these sort of hypotheticals coming together of Republican and Democrats in 4 years to basically ward off or beat back this fascist ideology. Like, it's such a fucking pipe dream. So anyway, we're going to end it here. I'm just getting too worked up. I'm going to try to relax and play this game. So hopefully you got anything out of it. If you didn't, fuck your feelings anyway. Don't care.